In the early hours of the 9th of August, 1942, in the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and the small volcanic outcrop of Savo Island, one of the most catastrophic defeats in the history of Allied naval power unfolded in the dark. The Battle of Savo Island lasted barely half an hour. When it was over, for cruisers had been sent to the bottom, hundreds of sailors were dead, and the commanders responsible would spend months ensuring that the full truth of what had happened that night remained buried. The Allied screening force had been larger, it had radar, and it had prior warning. None of it mattered. In 32 minutes, Vice Admiral Mikawa rewrote what naval professionals thought they understood about night combat. This is how he did it. To understand the scale of what happened off Savo Island, you first have to understand what was at stake in the waters around Guadalcanal in the opening days of August 1942. On the 7th of August, Allied forces, predominantly United States Marines, had landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island in the eastern Solomon Islands. It was the first major Allied land offensive against Japan in the entire Pacific War, a campaign later codenamed Operation Watchtower, and less charitably nicknamed by the men who carried it out as Operation Shoestring. The objective was an airfield the Japanese were constructing at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. If Japan completed and garrisoned that airfield, long-range bombers operating from it could threaten the entire supply corridor between the American West Coast and Australia, a strategic artery the Allies could not afford to lose. Marines secured the unfinished airfield by 4 p.m. on the 8th of August. What they could not secure were the waters around it. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner commanded the amphibious fleet that had delivered 16,000 troops to the beaches. Protecting Turner's transports, still at anchor and still only partially unloaded, was a screening force under Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, flying his flag aboard the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia. On paper, Crutchley's force was substantial, 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers spread across the approaches to the Sound. On paper, the Allies held a radar advantage that the Japanese surface fleet could not match. On paper, 2 radar-equipped destroyers were positioned to the west of Savo Island specifically to provide early warning of any enemy approach. On paper, the transports and the Marines ashore were safe for the night. Mikawa's force, by contrast, had sailed from bases in New Britain and New Ireland with just 7 cruisers and a single destroyer. His flagship was the heavy Takao-class cruiser Chokai. With him were 4 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 6 under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, the Aoba, Kinagasa, Furutaka, and Kako, along with the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, and the destroyer Unagi. The 4 heavy cruisers of Goto's division alone contributed 34 8-inch main guns to the force. He had no carrier air cover, no realistic prospect of reinforcement, and he was sailing down a long, exposed channel that the Allies called the Slot, New Georgia Sound, in full daylight during the final approach, praying no Allied aircraft would spot his column in time for a useful response. They almost did. At 10:20 and again at 11:10 on the 8th of August, Royal Australian Air Force Lockheed Hudson reconnaissance aircraft operating out of Milne Bay in New Guinea sighted Mikawa's force and attempted to radio the contact report. The first crew, receiving no acknowledgement from the Allied radio station at Fall River, New Guinea, turned back to Milne Bay and landed at 12:42 to ensure the report was received in person. The second Hudson completed its full patrol before landing at Milne Bay at 3 p.m. For reasons that were never satisfactorily explained, these contact reports were not relayed to the Allied fleet off Guadalcanal until 18:45 and 21:30 respectively, hours after the information might have prompted a meaningful defensive response. The official American naval historian Samuel Morrison would later blame the Hudson crews themselves, writing that they had delayed to take tea before reporting. That version of events made international headlines and was repeated for decades. Research eventually discredited it entirely, and in 2014 the United States Navy's own Naval History and Heritage Command formally acknowledged in writing to the Hudson's surviving radio operator, a man who had spent decades fighting to clear his crewmate's name, that Morrison's criticisms had been unwarranted. But the intelligence failures did not end with the delayed aircraft reports. Rear Admiral Turner had specifically requested that Admiral John S. McCain Sr., commanding Allied Air Forces in the South Pacific, conduct additional reconnaissance flights over the slot during the afternoon of the 8th of August. McCain did not order those flights. He also did not inform Turner that they had not been carried out. Turner therefore believed throughout that critical afternoon that the slot was under continuous Allied observation. It was not. Turner also had 15 scouting float planes organic to his cruiser force that afternoon. They were never launched. They sat on the catapults of their parent ships, fully fueled, a source of dangerous aviation gasoline rather than useful intelligence. Meanwhile, Mikawa had entered the slot by 4 p.m. and was driving south at 24 knots, his battle plan already signaled to every ship in his column: strike south of Savo Island, torpedo the Allied forces off the Guadalcanal anchorage, turn north toward Tulagi to shell and torpedo, then withdraw north of Savo Island. There is one further element that made everything else possible, and it is the element the Allied command most catastrophically underestimated. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years before the war developing and drilling in night fighting tactics to a standard that had no equivalent in any Western Navy. This was not improvisation in the face of Allied technological superiority. It was a deliberate strategic doctrine, refined in training exercises through the 1930s, built on the understanding that Japan could not match American industrial output in a prolonged daylight exchange and that the darkness represented a theater in which discipline and practice could substitute for numbers. Allied commanders knew almost nothing of this. Mikawa had himself commanded the heavy cruiser Chokai and the battleship Kirishima earlier in his career. He had led elements of the screening force at Pearl Harbor and from the front during the Indian Ocean raid and at Midway. He was not an untested officer improvising under pressure. He was an experienced fleet commander executing a plan that his force had, in effect, been training for years to execute. Mikawa had also taken one further precaution during his approach. As his force neared Bougainville, he spread his ships across a wider area at sea to obscure their number and composition from any observation. He launched for cruiser float planes to scout the Allied dispositions around Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Those aircraft returned around noon and reported 2 distinct groups of Allied ships. By 1 p.m. Mikawa had reassembled his force and was pushing south at speed. He knew where the Allied ships were. The Allied commanders, despite their radar, their patrol destroyers, and their flotillas of undeployed scouts, did not know where he was. There is something almost unbearable about the Allied dispositions on the night of 8 to 9 August, knowing what was coming. Rear Admiral Crutchley had divided his screening force into 3 groups to cover the various approaches to the anchorage. A southern group, HMAS Australia, HMAS Canberra, USS Chicago, and the destroyers Patterson and Bagley, patrolled between Lunga Point and Savo Island. A northern group, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and destroyers Helm and Wilson, conducted a box-pattern patrol between the Tulagi anchorage and Savo Island. An eastern group covered the far approaches beyond Florida Island. The 2 radar-equipped picket destroyers, USS Ralph Talbot to the north and USS Blue to the south, were separated by a gap of between 12 and 30 kilometers, their patrol patterns uncoordinated. The radar they carried was also, in a detail that proved fatal, poorly understood by its operators. Shipborne radar of that period was substantially degraded by the radar shadow cast by nearby landmasses, and Savo Island itself created exactly that kind of electromagnetic interference. Aboard USS Chicago, Captain Howard Bode had ordered his ship's radar used only intermittently, 1 sweep every half hour from the fire control radar, out of concern that continuous emissions would betray his position to the enemy. The final sweep before the engagement began came too early to detect the incoming Japanese column. Then, late in the evening, Crutchley further weakened his own dispositions. Turner had summoned him for a conference aboard the command ship, and Crutchley complied, taking HMAS Australia out of the southern patrol line entirely and failing to formally notify the other captains that he had done so or to designate a replacement to coordinate the group. The Southern cruisers continued their patrol without their admiral, without coordination, without any clear chain of command for the hours ahead. If you find this kind of story compelling, the detail of how prepared forces came apart while an enemy moved with quiet precision through the dark, then subscribing to this channel means you will not miss the accounts still to come. Mikawa's column passed through the gap between the picket destroyers Blue and Ralph Talbot without detection. His float planes, already aloft over the Allied anchorage, had dropped flares and float lights to silhouette the Allied ships for the approaching Japanese cruisers. At approximately 1:36 on the 9th of August, the Japanese column was sighted by lookouts aboard USS Patterson, which immediately broadcast a warning, warning, warning. Strange ships entering harbor. The message went out, but the window for a coordinated Allied response had already closed. Mikawa's ships opened fire at approximately 1:38. The Southern group bore the first blow. HMAS Canberra was struck almost simultaneously by shells and torpedoes in the opening minutes of the engagement, hit so rapidly and so heavily that she was rendered immediately non-operational. She was later found to be beyond saving and was scuttled. USS Chicago was struck by a torpedo that blew off a section of her bow. Rather than turning to engage or to warn the Northern group, Chicago's captain Bode steered west, away from the action, and the Northern cruiser group, Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy, remained entirely unaware of what was happening to the south. The Japanese column split briefly, part of the force moving to each side of the Northern group, catching Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy in a crossfire. All three were American heavy cruisers. None was at battle stations when the Japanese searchlights found them. Astoria's own crew initially feared that the first salvos were friendly fire. Quincy's captain managed to bring his ship partially around before she was overwhelmed. Vincennes, a New Orleans-class cruiser commissioned in 1937, was struck repeatedly and sank. All three Northern cruisers went to the bottom. The entire action was over in approximately 32 minutes from the first shots to Mikawa's withdrawal. His force had suffered no ship sunk in the engagement itself, though the heavy cruiser Kako was torpedoed and sunk by the American submarine S-44 during the return passage to Rabaul, the sole Japanese loss of the entire operation. Mikawa then made the decision that his superiors would question for years afterward. With the Allied screening force effectively destroyed, the unarmed American transports remained at anchor, still only partially unloaded. A strike against them might have severed the Guadalcanal beachhead entirely, cutting off the Marines ashore from the reinforcements and supplies they needed to hold Henderson Field. Mikawa chose instead to withdraw northward under the cover of the remaining darkness. His reasoning was straightforward and not unreasonable given the intelligence available to him. He had been specifically instructed before departure by the Chief of the IJN General Staff, Admiral Osami Nagono, to avoid losing ships unnecessarily, and he believed, correctly, in terms of the information he held, that an American carrier task force remained south of Guadalcanal and would launch airstrikes against his fleet at dawn. What he did not know was that Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had already withdrawn his carrier groups to the south the previous evening. The American carriers were already beyond striking range. Mikawa's caution, driven by a threat that had ceased to exist, spared the Allied transports and, with them, the Guadalcanal campaign itself. The consequences of the battle extended far beyond the tactical destruction of 4 cruisers. Turner, now without adequate naval protection and informed of the losses, ordered the amphibious force to withdraw before the transports had completed unloading. The Marines ashore on Guadalcanal were left with limited food, limited ammunition, and equipment that was incomplete. The waters around the island, which would come to be named Ironbottom Sound for what now lay on its floor, temporarily passed under Japanese control. The vulnerability of the garrison during the weeks that followed was directly traceable to the night of 8 to 9 August. The damage to Allied prestige and institutional confidence was, if anything, worse than the material losses. Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, has assessed the Battle of Savo Island and the later Battle of Tassafaronga as two of the worst defeats in American naval history, surpassed among Pacific War engagements only by the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Allied chain of command had failed at nearly every link: Fletcher's early carrier withdrawal, McCain's unexecuted and unreported reconnaissance order, the delayed processing of the Hudson sighting reports, Crutchley's absence from his own patrol line without proper notification, Bode's intermittent radar policy, the 15 unused float planes sitting fuel-laden on their catapults. Each failure was, in isolation, defensible. Together they created a darkness that had nothing to do with the hour of the night. The full scope of what had happened was not made public at the time. American naval authorities suppressed detailed reporting of the defeat for months, protective of morale at a critical stage of the campaign and acutely conscious of the questions the losses would raise about command decisions. The cover-up was not indefinite. Accounts eventually emerged, inquiries were conducted, but the men who had been on those ships, and the Marines ashore who spent hungry weeks dependent on captured Japanese rice because the transports had left before finishing their unloading, knew long before the public did how completely the night had gone wrong. What followed at Guadalcanal was 6 months of grinding naval, air, and ground combat. The Japanese attempted repeatedly to retake Henderson Field. Naval battles continued through the waters of Ironbottom Sound. The campaign did not end until the Japanese, their losses in ships, aircraft, and trained personnel having become unsustainable, evacuated their remaining land forces by the 9th of February, 1943. The Allied garrison, the same Marines who had been left exposed after Savo Island with inadequate supplies and a shattered naval screen, had held. In the longer arc of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal marked the moment the strategic initiative shifted permanently to the Allies. But that outcome was not inevitable in August 1942. It was made possible, in part, because Mikawa chose not to push onto the transports, and because the Marines ashore were harder to dislodge than anyone on either side had fully anticipated. Mikawa himself continued in command of the 8th Fleet until April 1943, later leading the cruiser bombardment of Henderson Field in November 1942 during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. He would eventually state plainly to the IJN High Command that the continuing contest for the Solomon Islands was pouring Japanese sailors, airmen, and ships into a black hole. His superiors did not listen. He lived to 92, dying in Japan in 1981. The Allied dead from Savo Island, by contrast, did not get that accounting. They went down in the dark, in water that would carry their ships' names as a permanent record: Canberra, Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, for vessels lost in 32 minutes while their commanders were absent, asleep, or working with information that was already hours out of date. The battle was called, by the veterans who survived it, the Battle of the 5 Sitting Ducks. They were not wrong. And when the official history finally arrived, it did what official history sometimes do: it found a convenient culprit in the aircrew of the Hudson, men who had in fact done their jobs, and buried the harder questions about admirals and orders and decisions made in warm cabins while the Japanese column moved south at 24 knots through the unguarded dark. Nobody called them sitting ducks again after the campaign was over. They called them the men who held Guadalcanal. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to be here for the next ship story, subscribing and turning on notifications is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss it.